Welcome to visual journaling for stress relief and spiritual growth. And today in this session, I'm going to focus on watercolor materials and techniques and creating backgrounds that you could use for future journaling spreads. So I have out here some of my go-to watercolors. I can give you links to the to this watercolor set it's a Jack Richardson. These are metallic, and I'll show you an example of what that looks like. I'm not sure the brand of these. I actually love this little set. It's a semi-moist, which means that if I stick my finger in here, it's going to come off with very little bit of paint on it. It's never really going to fully dry here as a paint, so you don't want to use them too thick. This is my Winsor & Newton sort of travel set. It came with these little the little dry watercolor squares, and as I've run out and as I've added colors, I've added them with some of my liquid watercolor that comes in the tube. I have a variety of those. I'm not particularly loyal to a specific brand. I do have colors that I love. This is the Winsor & Newton Cotman watercolor. Hooker's Green is one of my favorite greens. This is a Rembrandt brand watercolor series. It's Sap Green, another one of my favorites. I have some Reeves brand watercolors, and I don't know what else is in here. I'd have to dig through. Looks like those are my main ones right now. So yeah, those are my watercolors that I'm playing with. And then salt. A coarser ground salt is going to give you a very different effect from a fine salt like this salt that I have. I apparently only have fine salt right now. But a thicker one is going to give you more texture, visual texture. Plain Crayola white crayon for a wax resist. I have not played with this. This is a China marker, General's brand, I guess. It's a waxy sort of pencil that I'm hoping will create a resist texture on it. And then I just have a little spray bottle with plain water in it, water cup, paper towel. I use these to dab my brush off. I'm going to use them to actually dab on things. And I'm going to have to go grab it. I have bubble wrap everywhere. And of course, right now it is not here at the art table. But bubble wrap, you could also explore saran wrap. That's a fun watercolor technique. I'm going to go over a number of different techniques, and let's just make sure I have this in the screen. Okay. So we're looking at some different techniques, and you can see this is just sort of a page that it's an exploration of colors. I left it as that in my journal book, but you could turn it into something. If you did these explorations on a different paper, here I did these explorations without labeling them, right? So here's bubble wrap, some splatter. Oh, that's right. Gosh, I don't see mine. If you have a toothbrush, one clearly that you haven't used for your teeth, that is a fun tool to use with the watercolor as well. But here, so this was a paper that I painted on, cut into 3, and then I put it onto this page, and then I used patterning to fill in the spaces. So couple of things that you can do. So where can you go with some backgrounds? How can you use these later? So I'm just going to, a couple of these to show. I want to make sure this is, so this is a page that I did the watercolor. Looks like I did some salts. Looks like I did a lot of wet on dry and wet on wet. Let it dry, and then I did the collage and writing over top. So that's one way that you might use your page, background page that you create. This is a page that has some of the metallic on it. I don't know if you can see the sheen in the video or not, but I created just a spread of oranges and yellows of all different watercolors, let it dry, and then I went to 2 different locations. The first one is to Chrysalis Winery, and the second one is to a coffee shop. I think it was Swig Coffee, I can't remember. And then I used my brush pen, the Pentel brush pen, to illustrate the page. This was sort of an observational with quotes of things that I was hearing. Another way that you could use the background is this page that I did. This one's actually a little bit of mixed media. And I did the self-portrait on a piece of rice paper and glued it on. And then I had this piece of rice paper that I'd used for something. It was a scrap, and then added the quote to it. So just one more way that you could use a background like we're going to create. So I'm just going to find a 2-page spread in here. And I think I'm going to go just over a page. So brushes, watercolor brushes, they're all different kinds. It's something to play with. I am very fond of this brush, have no idea the brand name, got it years ago, and it's one brush that I really treat very kindly because I don't know how to replace it, because I don't know what it is. This is a water brush, so there's water in the tube, and then I can either dip it into the watercolor and apply, or I can use it to add water, or I can put it directly in the paint. Soft brushes are generally what you want for watercolor, unless you're looking for a lot of control with it. If you're trying to do more controlled drawing, then you want a harder brush. So I'm also going to play with this. This is a round brush. It's a size 6, and I think it's a natural fiber. No, I don't think so. Liquitex brand is what it says. So if you're using liquid watercolors from the tube, you can spread them onto another palette. I have been known to use yogurt lids, right? So I can, and I like white because that way when I mix, I can see the color that I'm creating. If that is important to you, I highly recommend using a white surface. If that's not important and you're not really worried about the color, linoleum, okay? Then about seeing the color you're mixing in advance, then you can go ahead and just mix on any surface. Some people mix on plates, ceramic plates. Some people buy, I have palettes for acrylic paint that I use. So all that said, I'm going to start with the wax resist because the paper right now is dry and it's really hard to go back into the page once it's wet. So I encourage you to think abstractly, non-representational. So lines and shapes and colors and patterns, rather than trying to draw something representational, since it's just sort of a background spread. So what I'm going to do is just start with making some marks and going with marks that feel good to me right now. And I'm talking really fast, so I feel like I need to slow down with some swirls that are going to loop out. Okay, so it's white, so you probably don't see a whole lot. I'm going to put some shapes. If you've been following along, you know by now I am drawn to circles. So I drew kind of lightly for that first line, and now I'm going to press a little bit harder with the crayon. And I'm just going to create some patterns with it. Repetition of a shape creates pattern. If you're making a sampler for yourself, I would say don't spread out the way I'm doing, and then label as you go. I'm going to do this wax pencil right alongside here so that I can compare the marks. Okay. All right, so couple of the techniques. I'm gonna, I'm gonna come out a little bit up higher here so you can see the paints in there, hopefully. I'm gonna start with just putting water on the page and then adding paint to it. So I'm gonna get a color. Where do I need to be? I need to be in blue. So I'm just gonna add a little bit of water to this so it gets a little bit wetter than what it is. And while it's still wet, I'm gonna go in and get my brush sort of full. I don't need to, and then I'm just gonna tap. And when I turn the page, theoretically, it dried already, it will follow the wet. There we go. Follows the water that you placed on there, right? I'm going to go ahead and expose this area now so I can let it dry a little bit. And I'm going to expose some of this. Rinsing your brush in between colors. That's I'm going to call it debatable. Whether or not that's necessary depends on how vibrant you want your colors to be. So I can work without rinsing the brush much. And here I'm going to do wet on wet. So the blue is still wet, and I'm adding the purple right next to it and on top of it. As you go, if you go into complementary colors and you're mixing them, your brush is not getting as clean, you're going to go into the browns, because that's what happens when you mix complementary colors. They create different kinds of browns, if you don't mind that. So here, wet on wet, just with some dots. And it is going to spread a little bit because the paint is wet. But I didn't encourage it to follow with a line. Here where the paint has already dried a bit, the dots are going to have a very different texture, visual texture right here where this is just purple and it was still pretty wet on wet. It's starting to sort of be like a star. Here the dots are holding their form because it's drier. So now I'm going to add, I'm going to try to really make it saturated. Saturated means more pigment than water. I want it to be really kind of dark. And I'm going to get my salt. And let's not open it all the way. And I'm just going to, now you can put it in another container and pinch the salt on. This is also supposed to work with sand. I'm going to go grab a bubble wrap. So, I'm just going to cut a piece of this bubble wrap that is apparently a circle, like a bag. Bubble wrap bag. Chop a piece out. And that missing bubble wrap is just going to like reappear magically. So with the bubble wrap, I am going to stick to the greens and I'm going to try to get, so I'm just painting it on there. It will hold whatever, more or less, whatever shape. So I'm going to go with the circle. And gently press. And lift. And here where it was wet on wet, the paint is going to react again to the surface. You can also, and I don't know if it'll finish by the time I'm done, but I will put so if there's too much water, don't squeeze and pull on a brush because it'll pull your bristles out. Just wipe on the edge of your water container and then press gently on the side into the paper towel. So I'm going to come over here, where? Here. Now I am sort of thinking about composition a tiny bit, only in that I've got this sort of flowy feeling going. So I'm going to put that down and put the bubble wrap on and press and leave it. And here is where you could use saran wrap, a Ziploc bag, any of those things work really well. So, and I'm going to come back again and I'm going to use, well, to make a really deep contrast here, I hope, I'm going to use the black, and I'm going to load the brush up with watercolor. I like to move my brush in a circle above, so like I'm stirring gently, right? Rather than smushing it in and just picking up the pigment. So, all right, let's see here. So I'm going to put that on here. I'm also going to put it, I want to mirror that shape. I'm going to put it over here. And I'm going to let that dry a little bit. So while that's drying, I'm going to use my spray bottle. Now I know that the blue is going to get spritzed a little bit, but that's part of life. I'm going to aim for the black. It's going to wet the paper around it. And in doing so, it creates this bleed, but it also, physics, right? It created a little bit of splatter spray over on in the background, right? I'm going to switch to this round brush. Now, because I used the black, my water has gotten really saturated with color. If I want to have a more pure color, I need to go and rinse my, change my water. So I'm just going to load it up and make sure it's still really wet. I want to see a drip come off of the brush. And I'm going to come over, and this is one technique of splatter if you don't have a paintbrush or a toothbrush. So I like to hold it near the ferrule, the metal part here, pinch lightly and tap. The higher up you are, the greater your splatter is going to be across the page and potentially on you. So do consider that when you are splattering. If I can't get more out, I can just dip it in the water, because I've got a lot of pigment on the brush. It just needs to be a little bit wetter to come off. And I'm going to use what's left on here. I've done fairly uniform lines, marks, filling in, sort of following this swirl. And if I hold the brush straight up and down, just the tip of the brush touching, I'm going to control, I'm holding towards the end of the handle, gives me a little bit of control, and I can get a pretty fine line with this thickness of brush. I can press down and get this thicker mark. I am going to limit my color palette here, and I'm not going to add new colors to it. I'm going to stick with the blue, the purple, the pink, the green, and the black, but I'm going to mess a little bit with my metallics. And my goal then is to just sort of think about the composition that I have here and what is going to help harmonize it, what's going to balance it. Do I need to add more of the bubble wrap dots? Do I need to do more splatter? And where can I do some more spritzing? What should I let dry for more before I touch it? So I have some dry on, or wet on dry here with this purple, but I don't really have that anywhere else. For balance, do I need to have that happen in these loops? Do I need to have it just up here, purple on pink? I'm going to start just sort of exploring and experimenting. The salt has to be, the paint has to be completely dry before you try to remove the salt. So right now it is still very, very wet. If I try to remove it now, it's just going to smear, which not necessarily bad, but not the intended technique, right? So now I'm finger painting, which isn't bad. It just isn't the technique I was going for. So you want to let this dry completely. Once it is 100% dry, whether that is an hour or 24 hours, just take your fingers or a paper towel and gently rub, and it will remove the salt. And you should have a little sort of dotting, stippling type marks. I am going to stop and take this brush out of the water. You do not want to leave them in for extended periods of time. Most brushes have the handle, the ferrule, and the bristles, and they are glued together. So leaving the brush in the water means that the glue, while it's really, really strong, will eventually wear out and be disintegrated, for lack of a better word. That's not the right science word. It's not disintegrating. It's, somebody's going to help me out with that. So play with this page. I'd limit your color palette. I went with cool colors, right? Cool being the green, the purple, and the blue, and one warm and one neutral. So warm being red, pink, orange, yellow, and then neutrals being black, gray, and any kind of brown. It's up to you if you want to consider ochre, which is a yellowish, brownish, a warm or a neutral. I'm looking for something that's ochreish. This one here, sort of a brownish orange or brownish yellow. Experiment with these, play with the textures. What happens if you take the brush and go into, or we call it sgraffito, right? Into the wet watercolor. So this is going to have an effect on the paint. It's also going to have an effect on your paper. It's going to create a small dent in your paper. Know that in advance if that's important. Experiment with the wet on wet, with the wet on dry. What happens? I didn't let this black dry very much before I sprayed it. What happens if I take a paint space that's swatch that's already dry, completely dry, like this blue, spritz it, wait and see. Layering. Watercolors are translucent, so they are really intended for layering. So layer upon layer. What are you putting on top of something else? What is the bottom layer? What is the top layer? This is the metallic. I don't want to go into the wet there with those. I want to go, all right, I'm going to come up here. And I liked that edge, so I'm just going to see what happens. So, but explore blending and mixing. If you haven't spent a lot of time with your colors, you know, I've got 2 greens in this set, 2 different greens in this set. There are 2 greens in here. I have 3 different greens here. You know, the same goes for yellows. You have all different range of yellow. This is an ochre, a citron. Here's a third one. What is this one? This one is medium yellow. So how do you know, if you're going with your color, you know, with your limited color palette, what happens when you put this green next to this green? What happens when this green, this blue, is next to this green? What happens visually when this blue is next to this green? What happens when I put this blue back on top of itself after it was wet? How is this blue going to mix with this red? how is this blue going to mix with this red? They're going to create two very different purples, right? Explore that. I'm waiting to take this off until it's also completely dry, which could be a couple hours, which means I have to work around it. That's part of life. What happens when you put the wax back on top of a color and relayer? So let's see, that feels pretty dry. And I don't have a lot of red in there. Oh, I've got a red over here. That's a red orange. There's the so I'm just reconstituting this tube red. That's kind of fun. So what patterns and marks? Explore your brush. Each brush shape has its own unique marking. How can you make dots with each brush? What kinds of different lines? So I did the number 9 round to do these lines first. And now I've got this watercolor brush back in between. How would this brush splatter compared with the splatter of that brush? What's going to happen if I put salt on top of this? How will that salt compare to that salt? Lots of different things that you can do. If you have a sponge that you want to cut up, you can use that to stamp. Dab with a paper towel. I can take my paper towel and I can dab it on the wet paint to remove some. It's going to make I'm going to dip it into the paint palette. Again, mark making tools creates an interesting texture. What happens when I use it like a brush to rub? This is a little like dry brush where you're using your brush and you've taken as much water out of your brush as possible. And so it's not that fluid, flowy type mark that we saw over here, right? This is more, the dry brush shows the paper through it. I encourage you to do an explorations page like this, and then maybe spend some time on another set of pages really pushing the techniques that spoke to you. If you really liked the wax resist, playing with the patterns. If you really liked the salt, playing and experimenting with how much pigment, how much water, on the page. All papers are not equal. All papers are not going to respond the same way to the paint. So you want to do an exploration before you get attached and are really thinking about trying to make something. This is just a toothpick that I had. Pull out the color, makes for some really cool lines. Very, very fine, thin porcupine tussock moth lines. So enjoy and sink into, fall into, get stuck in the process of exploring the paint and how it responds. If you have stencils, you could explore how do these stencils work. Stencils can be done with a brush. Stencils can be done with a dabbing of the paint. If your stencil that you're using is not flush to the page and your paint is too wet, it will leak through and you won't get the stencil effect. This had a bunch of different things. I went with the pattern there rather than the flower, the recognizable flower. But you can also make stencils. If you have some cardstock, piece of cardboard, you can cut into those a piece of heavy paper to make your own stencil. Enjoy the process. Just sort of let it go and let it be a beautiful mess of marks and learn from those marks. And if you want to know what they are in the future, take a pen like I had on my sampler and make a note. This is metallic paint wet over China marker. This is the squirrel brush, press and lift, press and lift. Because you may not remember later, what did I do to get that? How did I get that? Right? Oh, I make a note, spritz, wet paint with water, splatter. Okay, so happy exploring, and maybe your colors and your marks will show an emotion that you needed to get out. Maybe they will be a calming place. Let this be an exercise that just is and takes your mind into a place it needs to be.